So our next story is actually linked to this to the notion of the relationship between modern populations and their immediate heritage. And this is actually I suspect, a conversation that we're about to have, very much inspired by a headline. Italy's new ruins, heritage sites being lost to neglect and looting. And there's a series of fairly heartbreaking images, often of churches and or things like hermitages or halls of residence for monks and the like, which are being lost to neglect and indeed being actively damaged by antisocial behaviour, etc. in Italy. And I wonder if there is actually a connection here with things like Second World War archaeology, in so much as people maybe take it for granted, and especially in a country like Britain, or I suppose in much of Europe, where you're often tripping over historical or ancient buildings, that you can sort of see how this has happened and why it is that maybe compared to, say, the Colosseum, a relatively recent building, isn't prized. But do you think that there are ways of managing these sorts of sites that simply aren't being enacted? And so in this case, for example, we have San Bartolomeo's in Mantova, one of thousands of churches which have been abandoned or destroyed, and it looks in quite bad condition. What do you think has to be the lesson learned from these sorts of sites?
Well, the reason I wanted to highlight this story to our viewer is that we very often, particularly in developed countries, we see heritage conservation of World Heritage sites and damage to World Heritage sites as something that happens in less developed countries or in war zones, Palmyra being the most famous case recently. But I think what this story shows is that actually threats to internationally important heritage can happen even in the most developed of countries, like Italy, one where the heritage tourism offer is one of the most important parts of the Italian economy, particularly in poorer areas.
Well, and in this instance, I think this article's focusing on Sicily.
Indeed,
but obviously
indeed.
It's in the broader Italian context, yeah.
Absolutely. And there's quite strong heritage protection legislation in place, in particular in terms of exporting artifacts and so on. But what you have here are, how does a country, which has to prioritise its spending, as every country does, how do you deal with thousands of sites, many of which are no longer used? They're churches that the communities they serve no longer exist, or have moved, geographically have moved elsewhere or whatever, or the building's been damaged in an earthquake and is no longer safe to use. What do you do with it? And here, the article highlights, for example, Byzantine frescoes, again in Sicily, other late medieval churches. It highlights cases where buildings have been vandalized, damaged, where artifacts have been stolen. And at one level, it's heartbreaking. It highlights the work of people like Federico Limongelli, who has a Facebook page called Tesori Abbandonati. So my Italian accent's awful, but it basically means abandoned treasures, where he tries to explore and photograph and publish photographs of these particular sites.
Well, and do you think that this interests me in so much as I've, these are sort of conversations that we're having to have in this country in terms of how we walk that line between public funded or membership driven protection of sites and the priorities that, especially on a government level, when it comes to allocating funds. And in this case, what I find fascinating here is that there seems to be an element of embracing the abandoned aesthetic for the benefit, well, initially the benefit of reveling in that aesthetic. So actually, it says here, partially destroyed vaulted ceilings, altars and public pulpits which are overgrown with vegetation remind visitors of the exotic temples from Indiana Jones. That's interesting. In so much this is a way of engaging with this material that is entirely experiential, you know. And in some ways, actually, if you were to clean it all up and make it pristine, you would actually, arguably, destroy some of the beauty. I mean, one of the things, I've absolutely talked about this before, but one of the things that I've always wanted to go and see is maybe like a time lapse of the post-Roman world in Britain. Seeing Roman cities falling apart, for example, is something that I would love to have been able to see and visit and understand. And so I think there's a value here, and clearly there's a following, in so much as Federico visits abandoned churches, asylums, villas, and other buildings, and has more than 50,000 followers on Facebook.
I think we should make the point as well that, you know, that kind of activity, it happens in many places. You only have to think in Britain of the activities of Subterranea Britannica, which is a group who visit particularly underground structures, but, you know, things like Cold War bunkers and the basements of factory buildings and things like that, and the urban explorer movement, who do similar things, not always legally. Sometimes you know, they'll gain entry to sites just to obtain the video and the photographs. But
do you think maybe embracing that way of interacting with these conventionally unwanted sites is arguably a way forward? Actually, accepting that people want to see them. And it doesn't mean you have to invest in fixing them, but maybe making access safer, or making. But then again, sorry, I just had like a crisscross thought in my brain. But then again, there is an issue there in terms of local authorities wouldn't see it that way. I think all too often they would see potential lawsuits if someone, you know, falls through a floor and breaks their leg. Then there is an issue there in terms of safety. And so again, we come back to the sense of actually people not wanting to fully engage with these sites as ruins or as ruinous in that sense.
The health and safety argument's really interesting, because obviously it's relevant. You know, old buildings that aren't maintained do fall, you know, bits fall off them, and in extreme cases they can fall on people. That's a bad thing. I think the question then becomes, what do you do to mitigate that? Because you know, health and safety is all about reasonable precautions. So do you then fence off a site like a redundant ruined church and then maintain that fencing, or always allowing that if somebody wants to get in, they will be able to get in? Or do you do preventative maintenance to stabilise the structure so that it is safe when people do want to go in there and take photographs or have a picnic or look at the remains of the, you know, and...
Or I suppose actually that there's also an argument to be made that you could have essentially a tacit release that is activated when people enter the site. It could be a case of, okay, well, we're going to put fencing up. There's a notice here that says this site is dangerous, but if you want access, you are allowed. You don't have to break the fence, but on the understanding that in doing so, in accessing the site, you waive all rights to sue the local authority.
My understanding would be that, and I've had these sorts of discussions before, my understanding is that legally that wouldn't be tenable.
No. Well, no, indeed, yeah. But, yeah, just a thought.
Exactly. I think it just shows how intractable this problem is.
Yeah.
You either throw money at security, or you throw money at conservation, or you do nothing and accept that at some point stuff's going to be stolen, buildings are going to fall down, and maybe people are going to get hurt. You know, it's not there is no single solution that that doesn't have some sort of cost attached to it.
Interestingly, the Italian National Institute of Statistics has counted nearly 6,000 ghost towns in Italy, according to the article here, many of which are medieval villages that succumbed to earthquake or landslides. Some continue to attract visitors and tourists despite being covered in vegetation. Others, and I think they're still talking about the whole site, others have ended up on eBay. Fascinating. In 2012, the 25 homes comprising the abandoned medieval village of Patrarica, yes, that's it, or Richa, located at the source of the Arno River, were auctioned off with a 2.5 million euro opening bid. That's interesting. And again, maybe that's another a way forward, is actually to simply sell these things into private ownership, and then let the private owners deal with access problems and potential lawsuits.
Or you were talking earlier on in another area about converting a ruined medieval tower house into a modern house, and how that can be. Yeah, and you can do that sort of thing. I've seen examples where ruined buildings have had modern buildings inserted into them, so that they don't actually touch or damage the original structure, but they use it as a sort of as a backdrop or theatre set, or
as a carapace.
A carapace, yeah, and they're treated almost sculpturally by the architect. I think these are all valid solutions, but there's no cost solution that is good for everything. It's difficult stuff, and I think we just have to admit that.
I think you're right. And I suppose it is difficult stuff, but also crucially, we can all agree, hopefully, that simply leaving sites to neglect and looting is not great.
Oh, absolutely, and I think that the looting aspect in particular. I mean, we talked about Sicily. There have been long-standing allegations that the mafia was involved in art trafficking and cultural trafficking as one of its sidelines, and money laundering and so on. The famous case of the missing Caravaggio painting that allegedly was taken by the mob. So, having robust systems in place to tackle trafficking and heritage crime, which is what the stuff's looted because there's a market for it. Okay, somebody might take a piece of medieval sculpture for their garden, but a lot of it will be taken with the view to selling it on. And so having a robust system in place to detect that kind of thing is obviously important, and would act as a deterrent to all but the more determined looters, maybe. And so there are other things that need to be done that aren't just about physically dealing with these structures. And as I say, I have to say, we've talked a lot about Italy because the article happens to be focused on Italy. I can think of locations in the British Isles where buildings have been allowed to fall. I mean, English Heritage every year publishes a buildings at risk register. For its listed buildings that aren't being looked after the way they should be.
No. So really, in highlighting this news story, this is actually highlighting an ongoing conversation, really, isn't it? And I think we're likely to return to this in the future.
Inevitably.
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 Okay.